The next topic would be on postprandial glucose excursions and variability. Very important topic, and it's going to be delivered by Dr. Anjali Satya, who is a working consultant endocrinologist in Vijaya Health Center and Triple M Hospitals. I request Dr. Devi to present the memento and welcome her on the stage. Devi.
A very good morning to all the esteemed physicians here. At the outset, I would like to thank the organizers for having given me this opportunity. And the topic given to me is on postprandial hyperglycemia and glycemic variability, with a lot of evidence there, and there are a lot of conflicting reports as well. So we have, I think there is no debate on HbA1c being the gold standard in assessing the glycemic control of a diabetic patient. And it is supported by hard evidence from large trials, which says that if you target the HbA1c, you could actually bring down the microvascular complications in diabetes. But now is it time that we look beyond HbA1c because we have certain other issues arising. HbA1c, it just is a marker of a long-term glycemic control over the last 3 months. But does it look into the day-to-day glycemic excursions? Patients may have highs or lows, and this may not be reflected by the glycosylated hemoglobin. So if you look at an HbA1c of 7%, which is a target, the patient may have an average glucose of 154, but could have a plasma glucose anywhere varying between 123 to 185. And if we check a capillary glucose monitoring, which the patients usually do, and if they don't time it with respect to the meal, they could actually miss the peak and may be falsely assured that their post-meal sugars are normal. So far we have been concentrating on the glycemic triad, the fasting glucose, the post-meal glucose, and the HbA1c. But can we give a good report to the patient saying that everything is fine? Now, the observation has been that nearly 40% of patients in the so-called good control HbA1c group, they have significant glucose variability. Now, this is the tracing of 7 patients with a same HbA1c of 6.5%. But if you look at the tracing, you find that all these tracings are different from each other. Some patients may have near normal sugars, with not much variation, whereas others you see there are some different peaks, which is highly visible. But if you just look at the HbA1c alone, we may feel that the sugars are under good control. So what is this glycemic variability we are talking about? This is either an intra-day, or it could be within 2 days, inter-day glycemic excursions, which includes episodes of hyper or hypoglycemia. Now, postprandial hyperglycemia, which is very self-explanatory, this contributes to this glycemic variability. Microvascular and macrovascular complications in diabetes is attributed by various studies to hyperglycemia, but now there is enough evidence to show that the peaks and the NADIs matter a lot in determining these complications. And the pathophysiology behind these glycemic excursions causing the problem is excessive protein glycation and higher oxidative stress that leads to vascular complications. If you look at the contribution of post-meal hyperglycemia towards HbA1c, it was described by Monnier et al. Way back in 2003 that in lower ranges of glycosylated hemoglobin 7.3 to 8.4, the postprandial sugars contribute more towards the HbA1c value. But as the sugars increase towards the higher levels of glycosylated hemoglobin, the fasting blood sugars contribute. Now, before we go to the evidence per se, how do we measure these two entities? Now, post-meal hyperglycemia, we have simple tools like the glucometer. Patient may be instructed to take either 6-point or 8-point glycemic profile, either in a fasting state, and then with respect to meals. They could take a 30-minute, they could take a 1 hour, or they can have a 2-hour post-meal values. And this could give them a clue about the post-meal spikes. A routine 75-gram glucose tolerant test would also give us a similar clue. If we find a normal fasting glucose on a GTT and we find a higher 1 hour or a 2 hour value, we could get a clue that this patient has a significant post-meal hyperglycemia. CGMS is a very expensive thing. We don't have it easily available because it's very expensive, and also we need trained personnel. But that would be an ideal way to detect all these post meal spikes. Glycemic variability, there are a lot of methods which are described in literature. Now variability is an excursion, and you may see smaller glucose excursions and larger glucose excursions. So which glucose excursion is significant? They find that any you calculate that average plasma glucose for an individual, and if you find a glucose value which is more than 1 standard deviation from the mean glucose, this could be considered significant. The lesser significant are usually ignored. So the way to calculate glycemic variability would be, you take a mean plasma glucose and you calculate the standard deviation. This is the commonest technique which is used in most of the clinical studies. Or you could calculate the coefficient of variation, that is, you correct the standard deviation for the mean. There are computer generated equations. People have looked at mean average of glycemic excursions. This is usually based on a CGMS data. A continuous glucose monitoring system usually takes 1 to 5 minute readings over 48 to 72 hours. And based on the CGMS data, we could calculate the total ups and downs, and these are summated and an average is taken off. And these are the MAGE calculation. People can look at inter-day variability by looking at, say, you can just look at the fasting plasma glucose. You can look at fasting plasma glucose of day 1, day 2, day 3. And if you find a difference between these 3 fasting plasma glucose and that is significant, it could mean a significant glycemic variability. Often now we even talk of not only intraday or interday, visit to visit glycemic variability has also become a very important measure, where we can actually look at the various visit fasting plasma glucose or even HbA1c variability between 2 clinical visits of the patient. I would like to mention this particular analyte called 1,5-anhydroglucitol. This is a new test which has come, which measures an average peak glucose over the last 1 or 2 weeks. This is actually a monosaccharide which is present in normal foodstuffs. This differs from glucose only by one single hydroxyl group at that empty end on the right side. This is normally present in bloodstream of all normal people, but whenever the plasma glucose starts rising above the renal threshold, the high glucose in the blood prevents this molecule from getting reabsorbed. So a lot of it is lost in the urine. So what they found was, in people with higher plasma glucose or uncontrolled diabetes, the levels of 1,5-anhydroglucitol, they started falling. So a lower 1,5-anhydroglucitol would mean a significant higher plasma glucose. But this kind of a relationship is applicable only on a lesser HbA1c of below 8%. So this is called the good sugar, and when the values of plasma glucose increases, it prevents this molecule from getting absorbed from the kidney, so the level falls. So higher the level of 1,5-anhydroglucitol in the blood, there is no diabetes, but when the values fall below 10, below 14, then it is normally found in diabetic patients, and values below 10 would mean that this individual has frequent spikes above 180 milligram per dl. Now comes the controversies and also the positive evidence that we have. So we have 3 different types of evidence to say that probably we now need to include postprandial hyperglycemia or even glycemic variability as a tool to assess the glycemic control in an individual, and probably we must target these as well to reduce the prevalence of microvascular and macrovascular complications. So the first evidence came in the form of epidemiological studies. Since 1997, there were over 15 observational studies which showed that an individual who has high postprandial glucose, even in the high IGT range, it contributes to almost 3-fold increase in cardiovascular disease. There was a meta-analysis by Coutinho, who analyzed 20 studies between 1966 to 96, which suggests that both elevated fasting and post-load glucose contribute more or less equally to all-cause mortality and cardiovascular outcomes. But this was again in contrast to some publications like DECODE study. There is a large ongoing study now which has completed, the Australia diabetic study, and which after 6 years of follow-up in 10,000 patients across Australia, they found that Between all these three glycemic parameters, the fasting, postprandial and HbA1c, all contributed almost equally, and there was a continuous relationship between these values and the all-cause and cardiovascular mortality. Except for the fact they highlighted that even low fasting plasma glucose, that is hypoglycemic range, could be associated with a higher mortality risk. So these were the various observational studies which was seen in right from 1990s, and I would mention two of these, which shows that compared to normal people on the left side, the yellow, even the green bar which mentions the people in the IGT range, they found that there was a higher risk for CHD mortality. The Fuengirotta diabetes study also showed that people even in the IGT range, it was considered to be a high cardiovascular risk factor. What was the proof in the overt diabetic group? There are very few prospective studies, and one of these was the diabetes intervention study, which looked at the effect of 1 hour PP in more than 1,000 people with newly detected diabetic, which were followed up for 11 years. And they found that patients who had a postprandial glucose of more than 180 milligrams, they had a 40% increased risk for myocardial infarction than those who had a mean plasma glucose, which was much lesser. The Krinsley et al., he reported a strong independent relationship between glycemic variability and mortality in ICU setting, where people were admitted with different causes, and he found that those people who had lower quartile of glycemic variability had lesser mortality, 12.51%, compared to higher mortality in the higher ranges of glycemic variability. That means a person who had higher excursions in ICU had higher mortality and a poorer outcome. This was an interesting paper, which was actually, it's a poster presentation, but I thought I should just present this. This paper was presented by a cardiologist, Mellon Philip et al. In a cardiology congress, and this was a study on 50 postmenopausal women who were actually normal. They had no diabetes, but they had established coronary artery disease. They underwent 75 grams GTT, which showed a normal fasting and a normal post glucose value of below 140. They underwent a basal angiogram, and they were followed up after 3 years. The observation was that people who had sugars even closer to 140, they were divided into 3 groups, 2-hour glucose value between 87 to 106, 107 to 120, and 124 to 140. So those people who had in the normal GTT with a higher value towards the normal range between 124 and 140, there the progression of the coronary atherosclerosis was significant compared to those in the lower range. So the proof was that the coronary diameter was much lesser in those individuals with even a higher post glucose value, closer to the abnormal cutoff of 140. Looking at the postprandial hyperglycemia and the relative risk of death, all cause mortality, again it was found that people who had post meal sugars above 200, the relative risk of death regardless of their fasting plasma glucose was quite significant. That was the epidemiological study proof, which shows that yes, post meal sugars do contribute to all cause mortality and even coronary arterial disease. But what is the pathophysiological evidence we have? We have this evidence from both animal studies as well as human studies. The pathophysiology behind postprandial hyperglycemia or glycemic variability induced is primarily an oxidative stress. High glucose, this leads to increased superoxide formation at the level of mitochondria, and then that leads to increased reactive oxygen species. The glucose is diverted to polyol pathway. There is increased protein kinase C activity, there is increased exosamine activity, and all this leads to inflammation. There is a higher inflammatory cascade leading secondarily to endothelial dysfunction that leads to clotting disorder, decreased fibrinolysis, plaque instability, and cardiac events. So the primary causative factor is oxidative stress. This is well described in diabetes, is well described in IGT, and now there is evidence to say that even people who have glycemic excursions, there may be in fact more oxidative stress compared to a persistent hyperglycemia. The other effects that were noted at a tissue level were the endothelial dysfunction. The plasma glucose levels were negatively correlated. They in fact infused in normal human beings, they tried to infuse sugars to maintain plasma glucose above 15 millimole, and they found that the systolic blood pressure, the diastolic blood pressure increased with a glucose infusion. PPH also has been found to cause myocardial perfusion defects, and this was made out by contrast echocardiography. There is evidence for all these statements, but the time limits me to present all that. A deleterious effect of glycemic variability was also seen on renal mesangial function. Especially, they found that people who have high fluctuations, there was increased matrix production from the renal mesangium, the tubulo-interstitial tissue. This was also seen in umbilical endothelial cells where glycemic fluctuations led to more apoptosis. More apoptosis was also documented in the beta cells as well. Animal studies, especially in the rat models, they have looked at endothelial function and they found that there was increased inflammatory cascade, increased macrophage adhesion to the endothelial cells and formation of atherosclerotic lesion. Oscillating glucose levels again in these rat models found that it worsened the oxidative stress. The third evidence we have is from randomized control trials. There is both positive evidence as well as non-contributory evidence, which I will mention. The first was a STOP NIDDM study. This is a study which looked at the effect of acarbose in people with IGT, and they found that people who were under acarbose, the progression to over type 2 diabetes was definitely lesser. So the conversion of IGT to type 2 diabetes was halted. Also, they found that there was a decrease in primary coronary events. There was reduction in acute coronary syndromes, cardiac failure. The second trial was effects of prandial versus fasting glycemia on cardiovascular outcomes. This is called the HEART-2D trial. This did not give a positive result. Here what they did was they actually looked at therapeutic effect. They took in patients with acute myocardial infarction within 18 days of the onset of the infarction, and they put them on two regimens. One was a basal therapy with just basal insulin. The other one was they received only 3 doses of Lispro. They targeted only the prandial insulin therapy. They found that both these arms did not achieve HbA1c of 7%. There was not much difference seen in the two arms as regards the primary cardiovascular outcome. So we did not get a strong evidence from this trial, but they found that in one age group between 65 to 67 years, those patients, these were the patients who were admitted with acute MI and they were on treatment. They found that the time period towards a second coronary event was definitely delayed in people who were on prandial therapy. So that means the patients who were receiving prandial Lispro to control the PP excursions, the second coronary event was delayed compared to the other arm. The Navigator trial is another trial which did not give any positive result. This was, they looked at people who were already on treatment and they added on natiglenide and valsartan in patients with IGT. They were randomizing almost like 9,000 individuals with established coronary risk factors, and after median follow-up period of 6.5 years, neither of these groups improved cardiovascular prognosis in the tested population. But they found that people in the valsartan group, there was a reduction in the incidence of type 2 diabetes. All these were IGT patients. There was a reduction in incidence of type 2 diabetes by 14%. So this was a study on glycemic variability and mortality in critically ill patients. And here they found that patients who were non-diabetic but critically ill, low glycemic variability was associated with increased survival. But the same benefit was not seen in patients who were already diabetic. But there was yet another observation that people who are diabetic and who are critically ill, there was a significant glycemic variability documented. But the effect of the glycemic variability, if you try to reduce glycemic variability, the benefit was more seen in non-diabetic critically ill patients. So what they found was that attempts to minimize glycemic variability in critically ill patients may have a significant impact on outcomes in stress hyperglycemic patients. This study this was published in January 2013. This looked at impact of glycemic variability, glucose and HbA1c on major adverse cardiac events after an acute MI. So all these patients had acute MI, and they looked at the mean amplitude glycemic excursion. This was calculated based on the CGMS data. All these patients underwent CGMS study, and they found that those patients who had a glycemic excursion more than 70 milligram per DL, they developed they developed a second cardiac event like an MI, death or acute heart failure within 1 year. Whereas the HbA1c did not have a higher predictive value in this population. That means there was no difference seen in those patients who were having HbA1c more than 6.5 or below 6.5. But they definitely found that those patients who had a higher glycemic variation, the second cardiac event prediction was very high. Looking at the carotid artery stiffness, there have been fewer studies on effect of postprandial hyperglycemia and the prevalence of stroke. There was only one single study which I saw where they found that there was a slight increased risk ratio of 1.3, but we don't have larger studies. This looks at increased carotid artery stiffness in non-diabetic people who had only increased post-meal sugars. This was characterized by those people also who had a lower 1,5 anhydroglucitol. As I mentioned earlier, people who have postprandial hyperglycemia have lesser value of 1,5 anhydroglucitol, and they found that their carotid artery stiffness was much higher. So we have evidence for glycemic variability as a contributing factor for diabetic complications, but these are not larger studies. Some of them have given a very significant result, but there have been conflicting reports as well. Looking at type 1 patients, what is the effect of glycemic variability? Brad et al. In a 11-year follow-up study, he found that glycemic variability, which was measured by a standard deviation method of blood glucose over a mean glucose, was a predictor of prevalence of peripheral neuropathy, but not other microvascular complication. There was yet another study which noticed that subclinical atherosclerosis was also associated with glucose levels in men with type 1 diabetes. In analysis of data which was from the DCCT trial, they also found that long-term fluctuations in glycemia expressed as standard deviation of HbA1c also related independently to the development of retinopathy. So some studies showed benefit on one microvascular complication, not on others, where they were refuted by other studies. So we don't have a universal agreement on this, but overall it shows that there is an effect on microvascular complications. Glycemic variability in type 2 diabetes, again there was an association with microalbuminuria. They found that patients who were patients who were on hemodialysis, they found that higher glycemic variability was seen in patients who were those who are on hemodialysis than in hemodialysis free patients. In elderly patients, glycemic variability has a greater role to play. They found that in a veterans Verona diabetes study, this looked at people above the age of 65 years. They found that elderly people who had a higher glycemic variability of fasting plasma glucose alone, they were found to have a higher association with diabetic retinopathy. And mean fasting plasma glucose and HbA1c strongly predicted the development and progression of diabetic retinopathy in these group of patients with type 2 diabetes. There was an observation that people who had painful neuropathy also had higher glycemic variability than patients who had non-painful diabetic neuropathy. Kilpatrick was the individual who actually looked at the DCCT data, and he found that both pre and postprandial glucose and the mean plasma glucose were significantly related to cardiovascular risk. The fasting plasma glucose coefficient variability was again an independent predictor of all-cause mortality in the elderly patient, which I had earlier mentioned. And in multivariate analysis, glucose peak was a significant independent determinant of carotid intermedial media thickness. So all this tries to say that there is a proof, but may not be a solid proof from large trials, and we have some evidence to say that glycemic variability has a greater role to play, and if we target this glycemic variability, we can bring down a significant amount of coronary artery disease, we can bring down microvascular complications. Now this is an advanced trial data which was published recently, and they tried to look at visit to visit glycemic variability on the risks of macrovascular and microvascular events. This was a group which were enrolled in the advanced trial, and when these patients came to the clinical visit, they looked at the HbA1c as well as the fasting plasma glucose. The visit to visit variability itself predicted higher prevalence of macro as well as microvascular events, and there was a higher all-cause mortality in this group who had higher visit to visit variability post 2 years. So the question is, should glucose variability be a target of intervention? Glycemic variability should be investigated as a separate treatment target in non-diabetic critically ill patients, because we have definite evidence to say that if you target glycemic variability in an ICU setting, which we are already doing by a tight glycemic control and with a good protocol in ICU to maintain, we find that the prevalence of hypoglycemia has come down, and that also brings down glycemic variability, and that improves the outcome. There is little evidence to target GV in general on its limited effects on outcome, because we have conflicting studies, but we could individualize our treatment based on the individual's duration of diabetes and age. And in type 1 diabetes, definitely there is proof to say that if we target glycemic variability, we could actually bring HbA1c to better control. The therapeutic measures that we can adopt, one is through diet control itself. Advise these patients to have low glycemic index food. They could go in for a post-meal exercise for a shorter duration. This also helps in patients with gestational diabetes to keep their post-meal glycemic excursions low. And therapeutically, we can look for prandial insulins which target postprandial hyperglycemia. We could look for long-acting insulin analogs which also diminish hypoglycemia and glycemic variability. And now with the GLP-1 receptor agonists and DPP-4 inhibitors, glycemic variability has definitely been shown to be reduced in patients with type 2 diabetes. In type 1 diabetes, continuous subcutaneous insulin infusion is a good measure which can bring down glycemic variability and probably be associated with a better outcome. So concluding, HbA1c is remains the most important metric of long-term glycemic control, but I think it is now time that we also look at metrics of short-term glycemic control. Look at postprandial hyperglycemia. To look at metrics that measure the short-term glycemic markers, glycated albumin, fructosamine and 1,5-anhydro, which is not available at present in India, they could be very significant in predicting postprandial hyperglycemia in an individual patient. Future recommendations could be checking mean glucose and plasma glucose, postprandial glucose as short-term indicators. So patients should be encouraged to have 4-point, 6-point profiles on their capillary glucose monitoring. And patients who can afford CGMS, I think nothing like it, which would pick up any such glycemic excursions, and we could target them therapeutically. Experimental findings and clinical observations suggest that glycemic variability more than sustained chronic hyperglycemia induces higher oxidative stress, which leads to development of vascular disease. This is well supported by the pathophysiological studies and animal models as well as human studies. But in clinical practice, we should attempt to minimize glycemic variability. This would achieve an acceptable glycemic stability, reduce the risk of hypoglycemia, and probably reduce the risk of both microvascular and macrovascular complications. With that, I conclude my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, madam. Since the lecture was so clear and vivid, we don't propose to allow any questions now. We will move to the next topic. Does any therapy? Thank you very much, and I request Dr. Meena to present the photograph and thank the speaker.